We are nearly on time for our final press conference at the Fourth Synodal Assembly of the Synodal Path in Germany. I'm delighted to see all of you, to have enough breath left to be here at the last day of our conference. We will start with 4 statements by our panelists. Afterwards, it will be time for your questions. Matthias Kopp will be the facilitator, and we will also look at questions coming in online. Well, there are more of them than yesterday and the day before because people are at home and sitting in front of their computer. I'm delighted to have us gathered here. And first of all, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Irme Stetter-Karp, the President of the Synodal Path. Dear representatives of the media, it has been a rather tiring Synodal Assembly that we have experienced here in Frankfurt. And we have achieved a lot. Decisive texts have been adopted on the participation of women in all ministries and offices of the Church, on the re-evaluation of homosexuality, the magisterial re-evaluation of homosexuality, on a future of the Catholic Church in Germany with a Synodal Council. And I'm very happy about that. For me, there was a stage during these 3 days when I was not sure, and I couldn't be sure, how to proceed. When on Thursday evening the basic the foundational text of Forum 4 on the basic lines of a renewed sexual ethics fell through with the bishops, I thought, what have we been working for so long? My disappointment was with the rejection of the text itself, but also with the culture of debate within the Synodal Assembly. One could clearly see there are people in this assembly who do not openly speak their minds, and then in the vote, rejecting, pressing the red button, and who do not even then speak about their motives. The fact that there were meetings among the bishops twice, which clarified many things, was decisively important. For us in the Central Committee of German Catholics, ZTK, these debates among bishops were the decisive point to be able to say, okay, we can continue here. We do not have to give up on the project of the Synodal Path. We see a future for working together, a future for synodal decisions. Allow me, however, to make a critical comment here. It is good that the bishops have recognized the seriousness of the situation and have sorted themselves out, so to speak, internally. However, I ask myself why this formation of opinion did not take place beforehand. Because before these synodal assemblies, we offer hearings, briefings, opportunities for proposals. There were the first readings, and why, I wonder, can the bishops commit themselves only a few minutes before votes? Not all the bishops, but some bishops. The most important thing for all of us here on the Synodal Path is that the foundation of trust is there. We can only work together if we tell each other honestly what we think, if we are capable of learning processes and compromise, and if we are willing to move. Anyone who behaves in a statical manner here is damaging the Synodal Path, which has changed and will continue to change the future of our Catholic Church here in Germany. In the opening press conference on Thursday, I said that here in Germany we have to assume our own responsibility for the development of the Church. We are not taking responsibility away from anybody else. We respect different responsibilities in a worldwide synodal church. But I also said we don't give our we don't leave our runner's heart in Rome. And I stand by that, especially after this 4th Synodal Assembly. Now is the time, now is the hour. We are ready and willing to make difficult decisions together with the German bishops. We have signaled this willingness with our large vote in favor of the committee to prepare a Synodal Council. There will be much to negotiate, much to decide together, and with all the energy we invest into this church every day. I thank you for your attention. Thank you very much, Irmestetter Kat. So, Bishop Batzing, the president of the Synodal Council, Synodal Pass, is the next speaker. Yes, thank you very much for your attention as well. And with view to the president of the Central Committee of German Catholics, thank you for the trust of all Synod members for going through this crisis situation together, through speaking our minds openly, through adapting our methods, and through promising to stand together and to moving on forwards together. So I don't deny that this rejection of the foundational text on sexuality and partnership, text of the Forum number 4, that I was heading at the beginning of the Synodal Path, and that I don't deny that this rejection of the text was painful for me, because I think this text was a very well written text, an important text for many persons, and a major group of people were very emotionally affected by the rejection of this text. And that we could sort of make it up a little bit by reaching an agreement in terms of a re-evaluation of homosexuality, progress in terms of dealing with gender diversity, etc. This is good, but the disappointment is still there. As bishops, we are not a faction within the Synodal Assembly. And this could be perceived. So how each and every Synod member, the bishops are free in their vote. So whether they're in charge, in favor or against the text, or whether they wish to abstain, is their free choice. And of course, this is challenging, but as every Synod member in the room, whether it is a male or a female or another person, and they take their decision based on the discussion, based on what they have learned before, and the same applies to the bishops. So I think it has been a shock, the situation, a shock, but a shock which was necessary and which will help us with regard to the future. But such an important text was not met with a 2/3 majority of the bishops, but it obtained 61% of yes votes. So we will be leaving this assembly with a large suitcase, with a lot of luggage, so to speak. And I would like to point out again that we have taken 7 major decisions which will change the course of the Catholic Church in Germany. And they have a high importance in terms of signaling change, and this will have an impact on people. And we will take this suitcase to Rome. We will take it to the ad limina visit for the World Synod, ad limina visit in Rome, and also to the preparation of the World Synod next year. So we have a mission here, a mission that has been formulated in a clear way, and we'll put it on the table, so to speak, of the world church, so that change can happen. This concerns all of the areas treated in the different forums and the different fields for actions we want to tackle. I'm also grateful for the discipline amongst the Synod members, which allowed us to have a couple of more readings in the course of the last 2 hours. Because You know, it's quite challenging. We're not dealing with any matter, but we are dealing with the future of the Catholic Church in Germany. And this will have an impact on parts of the church worldwide as well. And this is a huge responsibility, and that is why we need this Synodal Assembly. And it is good that we have not given up. And the bishops set a clear sign. This synodal path is not only a stage or a phase in a development, but it is a path that is going to be continued in the future. Thank you, Bishop Betzing. And now I'm going to pass the floor to the Vice President of the Synodal Path, Professor Thomas Söding.
Thank you very much as well. The synodal path was on the verge of failure, but it didn't fail. The synodal path is a success. That is something that we can claim with confidence. But for this success, we paid a high price. The foundational text of the sexuality forum has been rejected because 3 votes from the bishops were missing. That constellation shows exactly how big the problem is that we're facing. It's not only a problem that is based on the statutes, it's based on the role of bishops in a synodal church, and it is based on the forms that we choose today to articulate our faith. What was the turning point? The turning point was a vote on the ministry and offices that women hold in the church. What a sign of hope. Now we even have passed a first implementation text on the proclamation of the gospel. So evangelization, that is also a very clear sign of why we stand together. The Central Committee of the German German Catholics has been involved for a long time. But we need changes. We can do what we can locally, but we also want to be a voice in the universal church. We are glad that now we are going this path together with the entire Synodal Assembly and together with the bishops. This is only a start, this is only a beginning, but it's a good one. What was the critical moment? The critical moment was that the Catholic Church didn't seem to find a shared language about sexuality. Amongst the non-bishops, there was far above 90% people who agreed, and 66% of the bishops were in favor as well. So that is something, that's a sign of hope that we actually saw. We are going to keep on working this topic as ZDK, and we hope that the Bishops' Conference, we expect of the Bishops' Conference to keep working this topic as well. And as Bishop Betzing has said, we are looking forward to see what signals the Bishops' Conference is going to send out. It was a failure, but we did not bow down. We stood back up, and we were able to pass or achieve a clear vote about the way the church deals with homosexuality. We also achieved progress on gender identity. Today we talked about homosexual priests, and it goes into the same direction here. The Catholic Church needs to face reality. The church needs to learn from the people. The failure was not the last thing that has been spoken in this matter. We can keep going with
Synodalität auf Dauer zu stellen. Das ist ein Durchbruch. Es ist nicht selbstverständlich. Von Seiten des ZDKs, wir nehmen unsere gesellschaftliche Verantwortung wahr, wir nehmen aber auch eine kirchliche Verantwortung wahr. Und wir sind dazu bereit, weil es die Zeichen des Vertrauens von den Bischöfen gab, die Irmestetter Karp markiert hat. Wir haben eine Verantwortung für alles, was wir beschlossen haben, aber wir sind jetzt nicht hilf- und sprachlos bei all den Themen, die wir aus Zeitgründen nicht beschließen können. Wir nehmen diese Arbeit in Angriff. Ich bitte Sie, uns daran zu messen, wie wir mit dieser Chance umgehen.
Herzlichen Dank, Herr Professor Söding. Ich gebe weiter an den zweiten Vizepräsidenten des Synodalen Weges, Bischof Dr. Franz Josef Bode.
Ja, zunächst mal begrüße ich Sie auch recht herzlich. Es waren unglaublich spannende Stunden für mich und für uns alle.
So those were really exciting hours for me and for everyone. We could call it a roller coaster. We could call it a multitude of different emotions. On Thursday, we were so confident, and then just a couple hours later, that damper, that shock manifested. That was faster than what we expected. And a lot has been said about that already. I personally am overjoyed about the vote about women in ministries and offices in the church. That's the text that I worked on together with Professor Sattler and many more people, and I'm still very moved about that text's passing. I'm very moved that we were able to have such a differentiated, emotional, and intensive discussion about that text. After the shock that we had felt the day before, that was a real positive development. Our separate bishops' deliberations during the Synodal Assembly were not only important and necessary, even if it took some time, but it was time well spent and it led to good results. We were able to get to a situation where we were able to agree on things. And of course, every single one voted as they wanted to vote. So we have the different resolutions, the texts, there are amendments, corrections, then we try to convince people, and in the end we have an end result. A result that leads, or that was decided upon in a debate that was held in a very disciplined way, but it also an emotional way. And synodality, listening to each other, being truthful with each other, it's something that we really achieved, at least from my point of view. And that has also been showed by the later votes of the bishops. The Synodal Assembly has showed that there is also development into the direction of a more differentiated debate. That was a process of learning. That's something that we felt very clearly. If we look at the texts that were debated after that shock, that is something that we felt very clearly. And I believe that if a bishops' conference stands behind the statement that women should have access to ministries and offices, also ordained ministries in the church, then that is a historical moment. Stating that so clearly, that is something that has not happened a lot in the past. So I'm very much looking forward to how this document is going to be received by the Church, and I'm also looking forward to see how we are going to debate that together in Rome. But the universal church is more than Rome, and Rome doesn't equal the universal church. The bishops, the lay people, the dioceses need to move now, supported by the texts that we adopted. Right before the end of our assembly, we were able to pass the text of women proclaiming the gospel in different offices. That was a document that we adopted in its first reading, and that is something that the diocese can actually use, and they can very concretely implement actions. Some dioceses are already working here, but now they can go further. Of course, we remain in a deep crisis. We are well aware of that. The crisis is not over just like that. On Thursday, that crisis was threatening to tear us apart, but we managed to build bridges, to stay.
Ein Ende der Krise insgesamt noch nicht einfach sehen, ist vielleicht diese Bewegung, das, was wir erlebt haben, das, was gerade auch in Bezug auf das Papier der Frauenkommission geschehen ist, ein vielleicht nicht so ganz unbedeutender Beitrag eben doch auch zur Bewältigung der Krise. Jedenfalls hoffe ich das sehr und bin persönlich sehr froh, dass es so gegangen ist. Danke.
Herzlichen Dank, Herr Bischof Bode. Ich gebe weiter an meinen Kollegen Matthias Kopp.
Vielen Dank. Die Kolleginnen und Kollegen, die sich online dazu geschaltet haben, die bitte ich über die E-Mail pressestelle@dbk.de Ihre Fragen zu schicken, die ich hier auch schon bekomme. Es beginnt der Kollege Gessler hier vorne. Bitte. Sie müssen aufzeigen, Herr Gessler, damit das Mikrofon zu Ihnen kommt.
Please raise your hand and then we will come to you with a microphone. Philip Gessler of Zeitzeichen. I have two little questions. Firstly, is it a good idea to, even before you start with the Synodal Committee, is it a good idea to look into the topic of synodality for months and even years on end? Will you get to a result that way? And secondly, is there a possibility to use maybe parts of that foundational document on sexual morality? Can we maybe use phrases and maybe adopt them in March? The Catholic Church is very well versed in synodality when it comes to synodality of the bishops. But what the Pope is talking about is synodality of all of God's peoples. And that is something that we are advanced in Germany, in our church here. I come from a diocese where synodality has been lived for over 50 years in taking decisions as well for the church in Germany and the church transcending Germany. This is new, however, and we don't want to exist without the universal church. We want to exist together with the universal church. So reflecting on synodality is an important task of the Synodal Committee, and it will stay an important task for the newly founded Synodal Council. In the Synodal Assembly, we will not be able to work on the foundational text of the Forum 4. That is very regrettable, but the text exists. And we have mentioned before how this text is going to be published, and this text is going to have consequences. And as I said yesterday, we are going to take this text with us when we go into further conversations. And in the dioceses as well, this text will have its consequences. So I believe that it would not be worthwhile trying to save specific phrases, specific paragraphs. We want to take this text with us because this text is the result of a long process. It's the result of many experiences. And as Professor Söding has said, the Church needs to face today's reality. So there's no alternative to this. From our perspective as Central Committee of the German Catholics, I can say the following. This transitional phase of the Synodal Committee, I also asked myself months ago, and we had many tasks about the question whether we actually need all that. And I want to give you two examples where I understood that before March, And those are just two examples. There are many more reasons why we need to ask the questions, how is that committee going to be constituted, who is going to represent whom, who has access to the committee, and there is many interests. We need to include the most interests as possible. There's democratic approaches that people want to see represented. Then there's the question, how big can this committee be if we want it to be able to work efficiently? So those are different questions that we need to ask. Another question that we also debated, maybe you heard about it, was whether auxiliary bishops should be a part of that committee or not. Maybe the ordinariates already represent the auxiliary bishop's interests. So it's those questions that we're asking now. What is the structure going to be? And that is not something that we could have answered by March. I don't think that these questions will lead nowhere in the end. I think it's very clear that we need the Synodal Council, and if we look at the majorities that we had, those majorities showed that it's not just us, the Central Committee, who is in favor here. The second question, I think I can answer very briefly here. Can't we take specific parts of that foundational document from the forum number 4 and maybe save them? That is a topic that we talked about in the assembly as well. That was something that people asked about in the assembly. Our common answer was that we want to use the implementation texts and that we want to pass the implementation texts as much as we're able to. And you can see that we've agreed, that we've actually adopted a text on homosexuality and gender diversity. And that is also important to the context of Forum 4. So there's a link there. Right, next question, Mr. Rottweiler. I have a question to Bishop Bode about the access of women to all ministries and offices. Bishop Kohlgraf said when the bishops met, he said that this is not about finding a position, it's something that we need to take to Rome, that we take to the Universal Church, and then on the level of Rome or on the level of the Universal Church, if there's a decision made there, is that something that we're going to accept then when it comes to women, when it comes to ordaining women? So is that something that is going to be a reality then? And then next question to Bishop Betzing. The foundational text that was rejected, that was apparently rejected, but that text is going to be present in the Universal Church. You said you are going to use it in your own diocese. So what's the difference here between an accepted and a rejected text? Of course, that would be a very important decision, a binding decision as well. But also the councils, different councils, decisions in the history of the Church, those decisions are always made in a specific historical context. And tradition remains something that is alive, and we will always need to give the Holy Spirit enough room to develop ideas further. So dogmas develop. There's also a history of dogmas. I would be happy if this topic would be discussed on that broad level, and then we can see where that leads. Bishop Betzing? Well, yes, it does make a difference whether a text has been accepted or adopted by the Synodal Committee or the Synodal Assembly or not. Because if it's adopted, it's more binding. It's something that believers, the faithful, can demand their bishops respect. So there's a difference in how binding a document is. The fact that I say that this text is so important for me and actually shows the direction that we want to go into, that is because this text is important to me. I find it's important that we find a way to deal with sexual identity. And that text put that question into faithfulness, into family and in the context of family and relationships. So that text actually takes the entire development of moral theory, of sexual teachings in theology and how those teachings developed over the last decades. And that is why that text already has consequences. This is why I will use that text often. And I also said that I will give this text to my diocesan organizations. I have many questions here today. Please ask precise questions to a specific person on the panel, because otherwise we won't have enough time. The colleague of the KNA is next. A question to Ms. Stetter-Karp and Bishop Betzing. Many documents are not adopted yet. So is the 5th Synodal Assembly in March going to be the last assembly, or or is this going to be prolonged? Then we have the question that was submitted digitally, whether there's going to be a digital Synodal Assembly in November. Well, the 5th Synodal Assembly in spring is going to be the last assembly of the project Synodal Path. Yeah, I can't add anything to that. And the second question about how realistic an online meeting, an online assembly would be. Something that we felt up until the very last second of this assembly is that people want to present their projects, their work to the Synodal Assembly. We see that need, and in just a few days' time, we'll start looking into what we can do here.
Mr. Rauch's next two questions to Bishop Besting. There was a criticism. One synod member said that the Bishops' Conference had promised to provide resources in order to create a job for a staff member, and this promise has been broken. So what happened there? And then somebody from Switzerland said that the text had been, first of all, perceived to be very inspiring. So what is your contribution to the World Church? And Ms. Stetter-Karp, what is your central learning regarding the dynamics of the conference? Are the bishops too slow? What do they need? More group work, more lobbyism? What is your learning? I start with the second question. It was always our maxim that we do not only work for ourselves. In the context of Catholicism, we are always working in the context of a universal church. And what we are doing here, what we are discussing, is an inspiration to others, and vice versa. We are getting inspiration from churches in other cultures and local churches in other countries. That is what is great about Catholicism. Your other questions, the Synod's Secretariat, yes, is facing a lack of resources in terms of staffing, in terms of personnel. This is due to this approach of making economies as well that we have promised in terms of financial resources. And those who are working in the office, in the Secretariat, and they invest a lot of resources. And sometimes when a new position cannot be created and there's a lack of staff, it is not possible to to fill in as fast as possible. We do what we can, but we have a responsibility in terms of resources. Resources we have and we don't have. So the question about my learnings, about the dynamics of the conference, you know, when I came here, I couldn't yet imagine that there could be such a painful experience as well. Painful with regard to the culture of our working in the different bodies. There are different cultures, so to speak. Let me explain that a little bit more. For us, as a Central Committee of German Catholics, we are used to, not going to a conference and then telling others at the last minute only what we really think. We have instruments such as hearings, where there's the possibility for each delegate to put forward a motion, to look for partners for their application or whatever, to have discussions, deliberations in order to put forward something that will be met with success at the end. A culture of talking with each other. To use participatory means, but you have to be proactive for this, not just sit and wait. And apparently, the culture amongst the bishops' conference is a different culture. I'm not going to describe it in details, but we were actually, shown this, that there are different cultures between of us, and therefore a clash of cultures, so to speak. And we know that changing culture is the most difficult part. And this is why we have to look at ways how we can continue to work together. Otherwise, a cooperation in a synodal council would be a lot of effort that would not be well invested. Colleague from HR, ARD, Masselschützer. Question to Bishop Betzing. What is the most important aspect that was adopted from your point of view? So if, let's say, the day after tomorrow, you think about it and you are saying, oh, this was really good, what would that be? And the opposite as well. What point is the one that you regret most, that was not even being heard, for instance? Well, I start with the last question. I said it very openly. It really causes me pain that the foundational text on sexuality and partnership could not be adopted. And the other thing, it is difficult for me to tell you what has been the most important. Bishop Bode, as a very committed fighter for women's rights in the church, has already pointed his most important aspect out. And I think what is very important is the signals we sent out to people of different gender and sexual orientations within the church, that has changed on the way. This is important. Okay, question coming in online. It's only the questions sent in by journalists, so questions that have been sent in at Pressestelle. Email address will be replied to later. Okay, and now, question here. The meetings, especially with the group meetings of bishops, seem a little bit like a black box. So, was there the need to pay the bishops a bribe in order to make them accept during these meetings, etc.? And is the real decision taking in the room, which was called Spectrum here, where the bishops met? Well, I could give you a fun question and tell you that, my jacket is a lot lighter because there's no money left. No, just kidding. It was a very serious situation. It was about failure or not failure of the synodal path altogether. And I have to say, I simply followed my intuition and did something which does not really suit me as the president of a conference. I'm not the head of a faction or a parliamentary group. But I saw that we needed a commitment and that we needed to find a way, an instrument, whether this is a lengthier discussion time or a third reading or whatever. And I want to put it into this context. So we delivered. And, you know, this decision to have the bishops, to give them an opportunity to speak amongst each other, led to this two-thirds majority being reached in the other votes. I give you a fun and a serious answer. We would have had other rooms, illusion and harmony, so I think Spectrum was the best choice. And now the serious answer is, of course, the decision needs to be taken in one conference room, in the auditorium, and we must learn. And we have, I think we can expect from the bishops that they be open. And when I refer to the women's question, you can read in the position paper that we share the opinion that arguments need to be put forward why women are still being excluded and not the other way around. So the question is, will this church learn to avoid discrimination? And if this church doesn't learn it, it will go on to lose people because people are leaving the church. And this cannot be what we want. Next colleague is Mr. Schlegelmilch of Dom Radio. Yeah, I can add to that. Time is pressing us. It's almost too late to react or to respond. And now we have this idea of establishing a synodal council. And if I'm not mistaken, the time mentioned was like Horizon 2026. So can we actually use or wait for this moment when you still have text to be decided upon? Well, you know, it is not the Synodal Council and this whole process is not and not exclusively about texts. It's about a different culture of deliberating, of taking decisions on joint resolutions at a diocesan level, and which do not only concern the tasks of a bishop. This is a real cultural change. And concerning this period of the next 3 years, in the statutes, we made that clear, we must show how the resolutions of the Synodal Path are being implemented and evaluated. Yes, there is time pressure, pressure is high, but we are working in a very highly focused manner on the Synodal Path, and we have so far been able to demonstrate that we can manage it. Then a question from Impulse. What about a church labor law? Was that being decided or negotiated? Regarding church labor law, there was a resolution that has been adopted with a large majority, which strengthens us in the Bishops' Conference. The former church labor law can be revised now in a way that corresponds to this first draft. So what we have here is a mission that we carry on after this Synodal Assembly, and it's already on the way. And you know, it's about the newly formulated basic order of a church labor law. It has been already submitted to those who deliberate on it and provide feedback, and I hope staying loyal to the process and being very careful with regard to all the steps to be taken. But I hope it will be finished until the end of the year. The colleague Kuke Brandes of Deutschlandfunk is next. Rainer Brandes of Deutschlandfunk. A question to Bishop Batzing. You said yourselves how shocked you have been with regard to the rejection of the text. You're shocked about this rejection on Thursday evening. How do you think you can make sure that something like that does not happen during the next Synodal Assembly? How can you avoid such shock? Well, this is the learning I take home, and I'm going to say it again. There might be texts or recommendations for actions that will not find a majority. You know, we are not a political office here and simply say yes to things that have already been decided. And controversy is necessary. That is not the shock. The shock was, and I agree with my co-president here, that this whole working on the text and the discussion situation we had in the general debate didn't lead me to imagine that we would not obtain this two-thirds majority of the bishops. That was the shock. And this is something I'm learning from. Colleagues of Vatican Magazine here. Sebastian Walters, my name, Vatican Magazine. I've got a question to Dr. Stetterkarp and to Bishop Betzing. The synodal path was started under the prerequisite that the Church's doctrine in the areas sexuality, women, power, and the status quo is discriminating and hurtful. And we have seen examples of this. So from your point of view, this conservative perspective on the Church's doctrine, is it still an option? This conservative perspective, can it still be justified? And against this backdrop, do you have any understanding regarding the dilemma which those minority bishops are facing who want to stick to this old perspective? Because you showed some sort of amazement as to their attitude, but you could also see that it's a real dilemma, right? Well, let me start. Well, although you mentioned Ms. Stetterkarp first, maybe this is a misunderstanding. My amazement was due to the fact that I couldn't foresee it after the discussion we had before. Because, you know, when we had our General Assembly of the Bishops in spring, we had an intensive debate and discussion on these basic anthropological questions. And I respect every bishop who says, I feel bound by the current doctrine. The shock was that in the context of the discussion and the general debate we had in front of the vote on the text, I couldn't imagine that this share of the bishops voting against was so large. I've got two answers for you. So you have been asking whether let me say it specifically, this position in catechism is a position that can still be represented. I give you an answer from the communication with the affected persons who are with us in the room. I was a member of the Forum 4, as well as Bishop Betzing, before we became presidents, and several delegates said today that you know, several names were mentioned publicly. They have learned a lot from them, and the same goes for me. And last week I had intensive discussions with young delegates, just not necessarily affected persons, but young delegates. And I have to recognize, and I want to recognize, that in the younger generation, when it comes to the question of contemptuous talk of discrimination against others, so everything that has to do with human rights, these young people have a much larger sensitivity and awareness than those of us who are older. And if you then look at those who have leadership tasks in the Vatican, then this might provide part of the answer, whether this, you know, perspective is even being perceived and reflected in any way in the documents. So if we don't want to risk losing the young people, we have to be more aware and more mindful. This is my first answer. And the second answer to your question, whether I have any understanding for these minority bishops and the way they act, I can only tell you, very often during this assembly, I felt grief with regard to how much fear there is and how much narrowness or straightness, closeness with those who say, I can't change it. I have committed to this oath of loyalty. And I perceive this as fear. And fear is never a good counselor. In Germany, there was a film called Fear is Eating Your Soul. And this is really something which touches me. Colleague Toussaint of Neu-Ohrwort.
One question concerning the past document on the reappraisal of homosexuality. There it says that all homosexuals should be able to receive all the sacraments. Is that something that you expected to be passed after the failure of the other fundamental text? What has become clear in the discussion, in the debate that we had after the failure or the rejection of the foundational document, that debate was really necessary for us to clean the air. And many bishops who rejected the text also said that the text moved them, started a process for them, and they said that they agreed in part. And that is something that the forum was really irritated after that document was rejected. That actually strengthened the forum in their decision to put these different texts on the table. So it did not surprise me that they were passed, but it was an important, a strong signal that they were passed in the end. It's not always easy to understand the dynamics happening in such an assembly at all times. But what Bishop Betzing described as a shock for himself, that is something that many people mentioned, that many people raised. And that is an explanation for me why and how the dynamic changed. Because people saw that they need to move. If I see that correctly, we have one more question. If there's any further question, tell me. Mr. Reichert of BR. One question to Mr. Betzing. So several foundational texts were rejected by Bavarian representatives of the bishops. How do you want to create a stronger synodality between the bishops? That is true, but that wrestling each other, that is already a sign of synodality. And it is something that happens in all meetings that we have, in all the general assemblies that we have, in our retreats, in our spiritual retreats. And we very consciously decided as bishops, we decided there are different theological approaches in our midst. And we also perceive a different theology of our office, of being a bishop. And we need to articulate these differences without putting pressure on anyone, without forcing anyone to change their position or their opinion. And that is what synodality is. That is difficult, but a basic assumption here is the following thing. And I mean, we all know the world we're living in. A world where everyone always agrees on everything would be very boring, and it's not something that God would want for us, because then our church would not evolve. So we need these divergences, we need these disputes, and then together we can find common ground in the end. Mr. Wörter, last question. I would like to ask another question. There is that reproach that the conservative minority discriminates here. A bishop said that they, of course, have a different view on the church and on these anthropological issues, but he does not want to be labeled as discriminatory. always. He does not want that label to be applied to him all the time. And I perceived that way as not really good for the discussion. So reproaching people and telling them that they are discriminating. So having that reproach and giving that reproach to that minority that they are against people and discriminate them. That is something that I want to ask about in more detail. Is that something that you perceived? Is that something you can understand? I am thankful that Bishop Oster and Bishop Handke have both articulated that. In the Synodal Assembly, all opinions are present. When we put together the Synod members, we paid attention to the fact that we want to represent the different that we have in church, in theology right now. We wanted to have all opinions there. What I think is difficult, and what is especially difficult for young people, because they have a different spectrum of values. They have a different spectrum of values than we are. Emotions that are being in the foreground so strongly. For me, that is not something that I feel. Discussions can be severe, and it's still not something that hurts me personally. But our assembly is very diverse, and we are learning all together that it is very important to pay attention to the language that we employ, and it's very important to look at the consequences of our words. And we need to look at those consequences before we speak. We saw a situation where bishops said things that had consequences, and then we had to deal with that after it had already been said. So it's a part of the process. And I perceive that the bishops who presented their opinions, that they actually were able to articulate that very well, and it was heard in the assembly. Dear colleagues, now, as closing remark, I would like to thank my colleague, Ms. Baas. Thank you for all being here. Thank you for the technicians of the Frankfurt Trade Fair. Thank you for the press officers of the ZDK and the Bishops' Conference. And thanks to the interpreters as well, who worked here and worked for the live stream as well. Thank you very much for all your interest. It is still exciting. Now Christmas is coming up, and we will meet again next year in Frankfurt. Have a lovely evening.